They were haunted by the most powerful governments on the planet, special forces, international agencies, billions in investment, and yet they never stopped. Now think about that for a second. How does a criminal organization manage to survive decades of direct warfare against the state without collapsing? Not just survive, grow, expand, become a billionaire empire. And here's the point no one tells you. The Sinaloa Cartel didn't win through force, they won through structure. Now let me ask you a question. Do you think cartels function like gangs or like corporations? Because if you still think this is just about drugs, you've already started off wrong. What you are about to see is a system, a machine, designed not just to profit, but to resist. Now hold on to this, because the most impressive thing isn't the money, nor the power. It's the fact that even when leaders fall, nothing stops. And that shouldn't be possible. Criminal organizations depend on strong leaders. When they fall, everything crumbles, right? Wrong. And this is where the story gets dangerous, because the Sinaloa Cartel broke that rule. Now think with me. In 2016, one of the most famous names in global organized crime was captured. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, the man many believed to be the brain behind everything. The logic should be simple. No leader, no empire. But that's not what happened. In fact, it was the opposite. The cartel kept operating, expanded routes, increased profits. Now answer me. How does an organization lose its most important leader and still grow stronger? That's not luck. That's design. And that is exactly what we are going to tear apart. But before that, there is something even more unsettling. Because while governments were trying to take down the cartel from the outside, the cartel was already operating from the inside. Now think about this carefully. What if their true power wasn't in violence, but in the ability to infiltrate? And more, what if a large part of the system that was supposed to fight them depended, directly or indirectly, on their existence? That changes everything. Because at this point, we are no longer talking about crime. We are talking about integration. Now let me provoke you. If an entire system adapts to the presence of a criminal organization, who is controlling whom? And that is an uncomfortable question, because the answer is not obvious. But stay calm, because this is still just the surface. In the next block, you will understand how it all started and why, from the very beginning, this was never an ordinary cartel. The origin of a system, not a gang. Before the billions, before the empire, there was an advantage, and it wasn't strength, it was vision. Now pay attention to this. The Sinaloa Cartel wasn't born big. It became big because they understood something before everyone else. Route control is worth more than product control. Now think with me. If you only control the drug, you are replaceable. But if you control the path it travels, you become indispensable. And that is exactly what they did. While other cartels fought over territories, they focused on logistics, silently, strategically. Now let me ask you, who has more power, the one who produces or the one who distributes? That was the first big move. But here comes the detail that changes everything. They didn't centralize, they decentralized. It sounds contradictory, right? But think about it. Instead of a rigid structure, they created a network, independent cells, autonomous operations, flexible connections. Now imagine trying to take down something like that. You eliminate one part and the rest continues. No impact, no collapse. This isn't improvisation, this is architecture. Now hold on to this because there's more. The cartel didn't grow alone, it connected itself. Producers in South America, distributors in the United States, intermediaries in multiple countries, a global chain. Now answer me, can you stop something that isn't in one single place or something that exists everywhere? And this is where another critical point comes in, They understood the value of adaptation. When one route closed, another appeared. When a technique was discovered, they changed fast, without hesitation. Now think about this. How many organizations can constantly reinvent themselves under extreme pressure? Very few, and that is exactly why they survived. But here comes the part few realize. They didn't avoid the system, they used the system. Front companies, indirect partnerships, financial movements that seemed legitimate. Now let me provoke you. If the money comes in clean, does anyone question where it came from, or do they simply accept it? And that question is more important than it seems, because that is how they began to build something bigger than a cartel. They built influence. Now hold on to this, because in the next block, you will see how this structure was pushed to the limit and how they transformed an efficient system into something practically impossible to stop. But before that, tell me one thing. Do you think an organization like this grows only because of violence or through strategic intelligence? Comment below. And if you enjoy understanding how these operations actually work, subscribe, because what comes next is where everything gets even more complex. When the system starts being hunted and becomes even more dangerous. Everything was working, fast, silent, and practically untouchable. But then, something changed. It wasn't a major operation. It wasn't an explosive tip-off. It was something much more dangerous. Patterns started to appear. Now, think with me. You can hide an operation, but can you hide a behavior? Because that is exactly what began to happen. Agencies started to realize that, even without a direct connection, certain things were repeating themselves. Routes changed, but always within a logic. Money circulated, but always following certain patterns. Now, answer me. When something looks random, but in reality it isn't, what does that mean? It means that someone is watching. And that is exactly what happened. The DEA started connecting the dots, slowly, without a rush, without fanfare. And here is the most important detail. They weren't just trying to catch the cartel, they were trying to understand the system. Now hold on to this idea, because when you understand the system, you don't need to chase every single piece. You go straight for the structure. But here comes the first problem. The cartel noticed. Not immediately, but when they did, it was already too late to ignore. Now think about this. How do you react when you know you're being watched, but you don't know exactly how? Do you stop, or do you evolve? And this is where everything changed. Because the Sinaloa Cartel did something few organizations can do under extreme pressure. They reinvented themselves in real time. Abandoned routes, new connections emerging, intermediaries replaced, everything fast, everything silent. Now, let me ask you, how many organizations can completely change their structure without collapsing? Almost none, but they did it. And this created an unexpected effect, because while the authorities were beginning to understand the old system, the system no longer existed. Now, think about this. How do you fight something that changes before it's even understood? And this is where the psychological game begins. It was no longer just about logistics. It was strategy. It was anticipation. The cartel didn't react. They predicted. Now hold on to this idea. What if the cartel was always one step ahead? And more, what if part of the authorities' actions were being predicted from the start? This sounds like an exaggeration, but it isn't. Because when you understand investigative patterns, you start to anticipate movements, and that is exactly what they exploited. But here comes the first major risk, because the larger the system, the greater the chance of error, and error leaves a trail. Now, imagine the situation. An operator fails, a route is used twice, a transaction deviates from the pattern, a small detail, almost invisible, but enough. Now answer me. How many mistakes are needed to bring down an empire? One or a sequence of them? And this is where the tension rises. Because for the first time, the cartel wasn't just growing. They were being pressured. From the outside and from the inside. Yes, from the inside. Because the more people involved, the less absolute control exists. Now think about this. Would you trust hundreds, perhaps thousands of operators, knowing that a single mistake can expose everything? That is the fragility of any complex system, and the cartel knew it. That's why they did something even more aggressive. They began to reduce exposure. Less communication, more fragmentation, more isolation between cells. Now let me ask you, if no one has the full picture, who can betray the system? And that is the beauty and the danger, because it makes the system safer, but also harder to control. Now hold on to this idea, because while all of this was happening, the authorities were getting closer. More data, more patterns, more connections, but something was still missing. A piece, a real flaw. Now think with me. What is harder to hide, money or people? And this question begins to open a new front, because systems can be perfect, but people never are. And that is exactly why in the next block, everything spirals out of control, because even the most intelligent system depends on human decisions, and human decisions make mistakes. Now, tell me, if you were at the top of an operation like this, would you trust the system or the people? Keep that answer, because what comes next is where everything truly begins to break.
The execution that defied all limits. Now forget everything you've seen so far, because planning is one thing. Executing under real pressure is something else entirely. And this is where most operations break, but not this one. Now think with me. You have monitored routes, agencies watching, internal risks rising. Even so, operations continue. Why? Because they didn't execute the way you imagine. They didn't depend on one massive operation. They operated through coordinated micro-decisions. Now hold on to this. Nothing was big enough to attract attention, but everything together was gigantic. Now imagine the scene. A truck crosses the border. Nothing suspicious. Perfect documentation. Common cargo. But what no one sees is hidden. Now answer me. Do you inspect every truck, or do you choose the ones that look suspicious? That is the first point of failure in the system, and they knew it. But here is where it gets even more interesting. Because the truck wasn't the plan. It was just one piece. Now think bigger. While this truck passes through, another has already changed routes. Another has already been canceled. Another is being redirected. Everything at the same time. Now let me ask you, how do you intercept something that never stops changing? And here comes the level of coordination that almost no one understands. There was no direct central command. There were local decisions based on global guidelines. This is rare and extremely efficient. Now hold on to this, because this structure allows for something powerful. Speed without depending on approval. And that changes the game. Because while an agency needs to validate, authorize, and process, the cartel decides and executes immediately. Now think about this. Who wins in a game where one side needs to ask for permission and the other just acts? But here comes the critical point. Not everything is logistics. There is an unpredictable factor, the human element. Now imagine a nervous driver, a distracted operator, a decision made too late. Small mistake, large consequence. Now answer me. Do you trust the system more or the people who execute it? Because this was exactly where the risk increased. And even so,
operations continued. Why? Because they reduced the impact of error. How? By fragmenting even further. Now pay attention to this. If one operation fails, it doesn't compromise the whole, only that specific part. Now think about this. How many organizations can operate with failures without collapsing? Very few. And that is what makes this system so hard to stop. But here comes the most intense part. Because at times, they knew they were being watched. Even so, they executed. Now let me provoke you. Why would someone execute an operation knowing they might be monitored? Simple answer. Because the calculated risk was still worth it. Now hold on to this. Not all operations needed to succeed, only enough of them. And this creates an absurd advantage. Because while authorities need to get everything right, the cartel only needs to get it right enough. Now imagine the impact of this over time. Constant small victories, continuous flow, accumulated profit. Now multiply that by years. That is how you build an empire. But here comes a decisive moment, because the more they executed, the more they became confident, and confidence can be dangerous. Now think with me. At what point does efficiency turn into overconfidence? And when that happens, mistakes stop being avoidable. They become inevitable. Now hold on to this, because at a certain point, they began taking bigger risks, bolder routes, faster operations, less margin for error. And that attracts attention, even if only for a short time. Now answer me. Is it worth it to accelerate when you're already winning? That is the question that defines everything. Because in the next block, the consequences start to appear, and they are not small. Now I want to know, if you were in control, would you keep scaling up, or would you start to pull back? Comment on that. And if you've followed along this far, you've already realized this isn't just about crime, it's about a system. And if you want to understand how these systems really work, subscribe. Because what comes next is where everything is revealed, and nothing stays hidden.
The empire that never really fell. On paper, they lost. Leaders captured, routes exposed, operations interrupted. Everything points to one thing. The system was broken. But let me ask you something. If an empire depends on one man, is it truly an empire? Because when Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán fell, the world expected a domino effect. Collapse, disorganization, the end. But what happened was the opposite. The Sinaloa Cartel continued, operating, adapting, profiting. Now think about this carefully. How does something survive the loss of its greatest leader without losing strength? That's not luck. That's architecture. And here is the point that closes everything. They never built a cartel. They built an anti-fragile system. Now let me provoke you. What is more dangerous? Something that breaks under pressure, or something that improves with it? Because every attack, every arrest, every operation against them didn't weaken the system, it forced it to evolve. Now hold on to this idea. When leaders fall, new ones take over. When routes are closed, new ones emerge. When methods are exposed, they change. Fast, without attachment. Now answer me. How do you defeat something that doesn't depend on any specific piece? And here comes the part that almost no one understands. Because while the focus was on the names, on the faces, on the leaders, the true power was never there. It was in the structure. Now think about this. How many operations were successful but didn't really change anything? And that is uncomfortable, because it creates an illusion of control. It looks like it's working, but the system continues. Now remember the question from the beginning? Who is really controlling the game? Now you have the answer.
And it isn't simple. Because at many points, the system wasn't fought. It was absorbed, directly or indirectly. Now hold on to this idea. What if part of the surrounding economy adapts to the existence of this type of operation? This means that eliminating it completely might not be as simple as it seems. And this is where the real twist comes in. Because maybe the goal was never to fully destroy, but to control, to contain, to manage. Now think with me. Do you eliminate something that moves billions, or do you learn to deal with it? That is the question that changes everything. Because when you understand this, you realize that this story isn't about victory, nor about defeat. It's about balance, an unstable balance. Now let me ask you one last question. If an illegal system manages to integrate into the legal world, where exactly is the line between the two? And more importantly, does that line even exist anymore? Think about it. Because while you watch this video, operations continue. Routes are active. Decisions are being made. Right now. In real time. And you don't even notice. If this story surprised you, the next one will completely change the way you see power, money, and control. Click on the video on your screen and keep watching.